Hi, everybody.
Hello.
This is Amy Asberg,
Hi there.
and I'm Christian Debré. Welcome to our online discussion of June 26, 2015. So, welcome to our online discussion. Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet is a project of Council of Canadians with Disability. Our goal is to inform, unify, and give voice to the disability right opposition to assist suicide, to assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other end-of-life practices that discriminate against people with disabilities. There are many reasons to oppose the legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia. Here, just a few. It's unnecessary.
Right.
Everyone has the option to commit suicide or to refuse medical care and have palliative sedation on demand in most European countries, USA, Canada, Mexico, and some other.
That's true everywhere. So there's no need for doctors to be killing anybody. People can die on their own or
you could kill yourself. You have the right to do that. It's not really a right, but it's not illegal. Okay, it's discriminatory. Why people without disability receive suicide prevention services if they express a wish to die? People with disability will be encouraged and assisted to kill themselves.
Right. So if we're going to have a policy for preventing suicides, that policy needs to apply to everybody equally.
Yes, which is not the case yet. Choice is an illusion. The choice to die cannot be free as long as people with disabilities don't have the choice in where and how to live.
Right.
There's no choice if you don't have choice. It's an evidence.
Right. And if you're stuck in a nursing home, you don't have a choice about your quality of life, and so dying seems like a reasonable option. But if you have real choice about where you're living, then it doesn't seem like so attractive.
Okay, we doesn't say that elderly house are not for everybody. What do we say is that some are bad, and when you are in a bad situation, you don't have choice.
Right.
Safeguard don't work. Where these practices are legal, safeguard do not prevent people from disabilities from being wrongly killed.
Right. Every week we find new examples of where the safeguards have been breached, some law hasn't been complied with, or some exception has been made, and people say, "Oh, it's safe," but it's not. Every week there are exceptions. So
yes, goal of our online discussion are to give disabled people a place to talk about these issues among ourselves from our point of view.
Right, exactly, because our experience is different from the other people who talk about this in public, and it's important that we talk about it among ourselves and hash out these issues.
Yeah. To organize our experience and expertise in dealing with discrimination and the medical system.
Right, because who knows better than people with disabilities what it's like to go through the medical system and how that doesn't work for people often.
We are always there.
Right, exactly.
Okay, to take our place in the public debate aside from conservative and progressive.
Right, exactly. They seem to be talking to each other, the conservatives and the liberals who think they're so progressive, and the people who are most affected by this, people with disabilities, are left out of the debate.
So our today's topic will be
the Americans with Disabilities Act, Part 2, the bill, and a news brief. So, excuse me, I have a rotten cold. 25 years ago, the U.S. Congress passed and the President signed a law that granted a broad range of civil rights to people with disabilities, called the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. In our last online discussion, we talked about the laws that came before the ADA that provided some rights and access to people with disabilities. Today, we'll talk about the passage of the ADA and what that law does and doesn't do. The idea of adding disability to the protected groups of civil rights laws first came up in the 1970s. In the early 1980s, Justin Dart, who was the vice chair of the National Council of the Handicapped at the time, it's now the National Council on Disability, met with disability rights activists across the United States. He submitted a report entitled "Toward Independence" to Congress and the President about the extent of disability discrimination and how to ensure civil rights. And that was an important report because there had never been really any documentation about disability discrimination before. So that was the first time it was really documented.
Yeah.
For people with disabilities, it's important that he wrote that report, because for people with disabilities, it's not enough just like with other groups. You can say this group has to be allowed to go into the store. So you can't just say you're allowed to come into our store if there are physical barriers.
Or get it.
Right, you can't get in, you know. It's not like saying you have to sit at the back of the bus when you can't even get on the bus, right?
Yeah.
Or you can participate in our event if there's no sign language interpreter. So enacting the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act in 1973 helped to develop the new ideas that would be necessary to realize equal rights for people with disabilities. Some of these ideas are reasonable accommodation, and we've seen that in other contexts, especially for people with different religious beliefs.
We was thinking that was new, but not new.
I didn't think it was new.
No, she doesn't think she's an expert, but I was thinking it was a new term. But no, it was existing many, many years ago.
Right.
Close to 30 years
40 years.
40 something.
Right. Fundamental alteration is another idea that we had that was dealt with in the Section 504, and effective communication. So those are some of the ideas that had to be added to the civil rights jargon to include people with disabilities. Toward Independence was also the framework for the first version of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was filed in April of 1988. That bill died at the end of the legislative session the same year, but it gained the support of then presidential candidate George H.W. Bush. So that was an important step, and it had a lot of bipartisan support, that first version. It was a little less strong than the final version.
Yeah.
So the new bill was filed in 1989 at the beginning of the next session with co-sponsors from both political parties in the United States. One of the main sponsors was Senator Ted Kennedy, who was very proud. He said that was one of his proudest accomplishments, was the ADA. And the bipartisan support was due in part to the 180 disability rights groups that pushed for the bill's passage. That's a lot of groups to be all together on one issue.
Yeah.
180 groups. It was also due to the work of Justin Dart, who was a Republican disabled activist who used his influence and connections to break down resistance in the Republican Party. And Justin Dart was the son of a very wealthy industrialist in the South, and he knew how to talk to the people. He knew how to talk to the business people, and basically convinced them that it's good for business to include disabled people. So during 1988 and 89, hearings were held throughout the country to gather testimony from people with disabilities about their experience of discrimination. And basically what they had to do is they had the report Toward Independence, but they had to establish what's called a congressional record, a record in Congress, in the official notes of Congress, of the extent of discrimination. And so that's what the hearings were for. They were held all through the country. We had a hearing in Boston, and I remember, getting people to come out to that hearing. Local groups, such as independent living centers, worked with disabled people to make what we call discrimination diaries, to document the barriers and inclusion they faced every day. So
we need documentation.
right, exactly.
We need your witnessing.
Right. So in that case, people they run into discrimination all the time, and sometimes it can get overwhelming. You just sort of let things go by because it's, you don't want to count them. But we told people you need to count every time something happens. And once they started counting it up, they were, wow, that's a lot of stuff. And
yes, it is.
And the same thing happens around assisted suicide and medical discrimination. People have things that happen to them and they don't even think about it because it's so normal to have medical discrimination. And those experiences are really unpleasant and nobody wants to think about them again. So even, disabled activists who should be, documenting this stuff. Well, I just had this conversation and, blah, blah, blah. And we need people to make videos and explain what happens to them because we need, in Canada, a record of this kind of discrimination. We need to have a parliamentary record of medical discrimination so we can show people that assisted suicide is the product of medical discrimination.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So some members of, let me just make sure, okay. Some members of Congress tried to add amendments that would weaken the ADA, such as excluding people with HIV and AIDS from positions as food handlers. But the Disability Coalition, that group of 180 groups, held firm. Everyone must be protected by the bill, or the popular bill would go down in flames.
Yes, it is.
Nobody wanted to seem like they were against the ADA. And if the disabled group said, you can't put this amendment in, or, we're not going to support it, the politicians realized that they would be in deep trouble. So, and this was a really major coup for people with disabilities all to be working together. So even though blind people don't really care that much about whether there's an elevator in a building or a ramp, and somebody in a wheelchair doesn't necessarily need sign language interpreters, we all stuck together and pushed for each other's stuff so that we could all be covered and protected.
All the things are linked.
Right, because it's all about including everybody and not discriminating. So the bill was passed by large majorities in both the houses of Congress and signed by President Bush on July 26, 1990. So I was at that ceremony and it was pretty exciting.
Yes, she was there.
Yeah.
Really.
And there were also, there was a demonstration to promote the law earlier in the spring, and there were a lot of people who actually crawled up the Capitol steps to push, show how urgent it was that this law be passed. So here's some of what the law does. The Title I of the ADA protects against employment discrimination in all businesses with 15 or more employees. So that covers most businesses, not all of them. There's a lot of small businesses. But yeah, it covers a lot of businesses. And it means that employers can't discriminate against a qualified person with a disability who can do the essential functions of the job, that means main tasks, with or without a reasonable accommodation. And, what I'm saying here is just a really, really overview. It doesn't cover most of it, but it's just to give you a little idea of what's covered. I actually had a 2-week training on the bill afterwards, so that's how much material was in it. Title II of the ADA requires that all state and local government programs and services be accessible to people with disabilities.
There is a little difference with Canada, which federal does not have the responsibility of the social things, so it's a little bit different in Canada.
Right.
But in the building code, the Canadian building code, it is exactly the same.
Right, exactly. And there are, we have to be creative about ways to make these kind of protections happen in Canada. So what the Title II was similar to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and covered many of the same state and local government agencies. Also, many activists thought it to be a second chance to press for enforcement of Section 504 and to improve access to infrastructure and public transit. And as we talked about last week, it took 4 years even for the first set of regulations for Section 504 to be written, and it was very hard to get it enforced. So this was the second try to push the state agencies and the local agencies to comply. Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act requires public accommodations, which means private businesses, privately owned businesses that offer goods and services to the public, to make those goods and services available to and usable by people with disabilities. And the public accommodations were already in older civil rights laws, but here are what is a public accommodation. It includes hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, conference centers or lecture halls, retail stores, dry cleaners, beauty salons, and other service establishments, transit stations, libraries or museums, health clubs, social service agencies, private schools, and parks and zoos, etc., things like that. So that is most privately owned businesses.
Yes.
And it's really comprehensive. And you know, there was a lot of struggle in the courts over public accommodations for access, you know, non-discrimination against Blacks. So all that was resolved by the time the ADA come along. But there was people still fought because they didn't want to have to do lots of things to be accessible. But the ADA didn't have a lot of, the requirements for existing businesses were pretty small. But the ADA required that all new construction meet strict federal accessibility guidelines that were published with the law. And it also mandated that renovations have to be barrier-free, and accessibility features might have to be added to allow people to get into and use the building. And it sort of depended on which part of the law you're talking about. But yeah, you had to make it accessible to get into the building.
Yeah.
You know, there was no ADA police. People said, well, how are we going to enforce this? Well, it was up to the individuals. Enforcement comes from individual action. So people can use the law as a leverage to negotiate with a business owner or a local government to create access or stop a discriminatory practice. And that's the thing that people do most. It's the most successful because, you know, before you get to an adversarial relationship, if you can just negotiate, that's the most effective. The second option is to bring a complaint with the appropriate federal agency, like the Department of Justice or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And the final option, not very exciting, but sometimes necessary, is to file a lawsuit. So the question really is, what do visible fire alarms and the circumference of grab bars have to do with assisted suicide and euthanasia, you might ask?
Oh, yeah, you could ask, but think about it.
Yeah.
The answer is
opposing medical killing isn't just about maintaining life. It's about having real choice and the best possible quality of life.
Yes, that is the link.
Right. As long as people with disabilities are kept out of public places and services, transportation, government activities, our quality of life is going to be lower, right?
Right.
And we will remain out of public sight, out of public mind, and therefore vulnerable to public neglect. If they don't see us, we don't count. So all of the guarantees of equality in all of the constitutions in the world will mean nothing if we can't be out, about, and integrated in our community. So Canada has these really great sections in the Constitution that say everybody's equal, But without a very clear law to make it, without a law to make it clear of what equal means, then it's kind of meaningless to say everybody's equal. And that's why the ADA is important. That's why this kind of law is important. And, you know, if we're kept out of sight, it's easier to neglect us. It's easier to just say, well, they aren't important.
Yeah, and there is a kind of proof of that. The town where we live right now tried to pass some different rules about the using of the electrical wheelchair.
Right.
Why? Because there is many wheelchair in the road right now,
right.
on the road. Before, even if it was existed already since a lot of years, nobody take care because you could not see them, or you see them once in a while. But right now there's many, so we are visible. They do something.
Right, and the problem is, of course, that the quality of the sidewalks is so poor, and there aren't curb ramps. People can't use the sidewalk, so of course they have to go in the road.
Yeah.
But that makes it dangerous for the people and for the drivers, so it causes a problem. But the problem isn't the people with disabilities. The problem is the town and the way they build their infrastructure.
Yes.
And that's the kind of thing that's covered by the ADA, and it's not covered here, and people don't think about it. So that's what having equal rights really means in action. Okay. So we have one news brief, which is that the Canadian Medical Association issued a draft document called Principles-Based Approach to Assisted Dying in Canada on June 16th, which was 10 days ago. This is after their nationwide consultation process last year, which excluded Quebec because they said Quebec already had their own process, and it also follows the Supreme Court decision in the Carter case earlier this year. The CMA is now asking interested parties to comment on its document and to answer the following 4 questions. 1, what should be the process followed after the patient, as opposed to the person, after a person asks for medical aid in dying? What oversight and data reporting mechanisms should exist? For those physicians who refuse to participate in assisted dying for whatever reason, how do we reconcile this refusal with their obligation to ensure equitable access? What mechanism can physicians employ to ensure this access? And finally, the Supreme Court of Canada has laid out in broad terms which patients, meaning people, will qualify for assistance in dying, i.e. those with grievous and irremediable suffering. That includes people with disabilities. They said it specifically. Since should there be other clinical specifications or requirements? Those are the 4 questions. They want their responses to be submitted to the CMA by July 6th. So that's not much time.
It's very short.
Right.
Hard to find.
Right.
And no publicity.
Right.
I don't think they expect a lot of answer.
Right. It's a short turnaround time. They did not publicize it. There was no press release. It's not on their main website. I looked, and it's not easy to find. And the fact that the document is hard to find and only available online in a PDF format. I have it in Word format only because I received it as an attachment to an email. And that seems to indicate the CMA is not looking for a robust response to their document, but it's up to us to prove them wrong.
And we have to, unless we want to die.
Right, unless we want them running over us. And once again, the medical establishment making decisions about our lives. That's not, that's something that we fight against all the time. The medical model, well, this is what we're fighting against. So you can visit our Facebook page for a link to the PDF document. And I also put up a link to the Microsoft Word version of the document on our page because PDF is not usable for lots of people with visual impairments. Screen readers don't like it. You can submit your comments to the CMA now, and please You know, it doesn't have to be fancy. Just write something to the CMA saying,
Do it.
you know, this
Do
is
something.
yeah, saying, you know, this isn't okay. Okay, so to watch our videos of our online discussions, which we've been doing for 1.5 years now, you can do a search on Google or YouTube for euthanasia and disability. Also, if you want to participate online, send me an email. Send me your email address, and I will send you a link to join us live. And on our Facebook page, there's always a link about a half an hour before we start. You can get more information about the topics we discuss on our Facebook page at facebook.com/toujours vivant not dead yet. That's all one word. You could go to our website at tvndy.ca. You can email me at info@tv-ndy.ca, or you can follow me on Twitter @TVNDY. Thank you very much for joining me, and thank you,
everybody,
Christina, for helping out.
Thank you, Amy.
And we'll
take care, everybody.
See you again soon.
See you
See you next
week.
time.
Bye.